You so much, Marvin. Amen. 2 Corinthians chapter number 11, starting at verse number 7. Now, any time in which a person needs to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that they are who they say they are, anytime somebody needs to do that, there is a unique form of identification that authenticates you better than does any other. There is a form of identification that is impossible to fake. There is a litmus test of identity that is more unique to you and more unimpeccable than any other form of identification. And it is your God-given fingerprint. Every human being has a fingerprint. That's the reason why law enforcement uses them as their primary means of identity and investigation. Let's say that you have an evil, identical twin who wants to imitate you and frame you for a crime. My first question is, what did you do to your brother or sister to make them hate you so much? That would be my first question. But your identical twin can claim to be you, can look like you, can sound like you. But there is one unique calling card that not even your identical twin would be able to imitate. And that is the fact that even your identical twin would have a different fingerprint. Now, every single human being on this planet is doing an active investigation. Every single person is doing an active investigation trying to get to the truth. An investigation everyone is doing to try to separate the one who is representing the actual meaning of it all from the one who is representing a lie. Now, Satan simply desires this, for no one to believe the truth. Satan will take any lie over the truth. Now, Satan wishes, he wishes that he could just tell a bold-faced lie outright and get away with it. And of course, sometimes he can. But more often than not, what Satan has to do is make his lie look like the truth. But there is a serious problem for Satan. Satan's enemy twin has different fingerprints. No matter how hard Satan tries, Satan cannot imitate the unique fingerprints of a genuine servant of Christ. If these fingerprints authenticate us, and if these fingerprints of a genuine servant of Christ condemn the imposters, expose the fakes, make the darkness look like the lie that it is, then I reckon these are qualities that really ought to be stressed. But here's the difference between your spiritual fingerprints and your natural fingerprints. Your natural fingerprints, they just passively stay on your hands no matter what you do, right? I mean, they are just as clear as ever. No responsibility on your part keeps your natural fingerprints crystal clear. But it ain't that way with spiritual fingerprints. Even though, yes, your spiritual fingerprints are in your very DNA because they come with the second birth that you have received. But our exercising them is what keeps them visible so that the world can clearly see them. so that the world is able to see the difference between us and Satan's impostors. And the three fingerprints of God's unique, genuine messenger that we see in this passage before us this morning are these: humility, truth, and love. Now, in 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is in a war with the false apostles who had infiltrated the church at Corinth. And these false apostles had painted Paul as a bad guy. And they didn't only attack the gospel that Paul preached, they also attacked the character of Paul himself. So that shows us something. We see that the spiritual war that we are in is not exclusively a war of ideas, even though at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's a war of ideas. But also, those ideas are promoted by individuals. Individuals, messengers, who either authenticate the idea they are presenting by their character or misrepresent the idea that they are representing. And so we see that the shade or the good appearance of the message depends in part on the appearance of the messenger. So we see, folks, it's not good enough to be right. You also have to be good. It's not enough to be right. We also have to be good. No one is going to listen to the truth from someone who does not make the truth look good. Or dare I say, no one's going to listen to the truth from someone who doesn't, by their character, make the truth look true. Most of the church at Corinth has repented, has re-embraced Paul and Paul's gospel. But some were still siding with the false teachers. Now, in the first part of 2 Corinthians, Paul addressed the repentant. But now, in these final chapters of 2 Corinthians, Paul actually addresses the unrepentant, and so his tone becomes less consolable and more confrontational. The false apostles, they may have had an impressive presentation, but their lies are exposed by their fingerprints. What sets apart a genuine servant of Christ is always, first of all, humility. Humility. Paul's humility was actually used against him by the false teachers. But Paul here points out that that argument, it doesn't actually make any sense. Look at verse 7. Here's what Paul writes in verse 7. Have I committed an offense in abasing myself that ye might be exalted, because I have preached to you the gospel of God freely? Paul's question here to the Corinthians is one that is so obvious it could rightfully be called sarcasm. Was it a sin for me to humble myself? Was it a sin for me to lower myself so that you could be better off? Well, It goes without saying that not only is that not a sin, but suffering for someone else's benefit is the most Christ-like thing a person can do. The last phrase in this verse explains exactly how it is that Paul particularly humbled himself for their betterment. See, humility might begin as a strictly internal view of myself. On the inside, this is how I view myself. But it doesn't stay internal. Humility doesn't stay invisible. It's true, it doesn't boast in itself, but it doesn't remain invisible either. Humility will put itself on full display through the decisions that you make and what you are willing to suffer. Because attitude without action is worthless. And so Paul, he didn't just claim to be humble, he demonstrated his humility, in his case, by refusing money from the Corinthian church. Now, Paul should not have had to preach for free. He should not have had to do that. Just like Christ should not have had to go to the cross. I mean, should the innocent have to suffer for the guilty? Of course not. But the question for the Christian is not what I should have to do. Hey, I shouldn't have to do this. No. The question for the Christian is not what should I have to do. The question for the Christian is, what can I do? When it comes to making sacrifices, Christians don't do things because they have to. Christians do things because they can. Paul laid out very well in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 that a minister is entitled to earthly compensation for his labor. However, Paul was fully aware of the spiritual immaturity of the Corinthians. And he was very well aware that at least for some of them, it would be impossible for him to ever shake off this notion that he was some sort of a money-grubbing preacher, as long as he so much as took a solitary dime from them. And so he was willing to do the unthinkable. I want to give you 3 little words. And in these 3 little words, one finds really very much the heart of Christianity. And these 3 little words are these: waiving your rights. Waiving your rights. Now, waiving your rights has nothing to do with denying that they are your rights. In fact, it's the opposite of that. The fact that these, yes, absolutely, positively are your rights is what makes your sacrifice so meaningful when you choose not to take advantage of them. And Jesus Christ is our supreme example of waiving one's own rights for the good of others and for the glory of God. I mean, listen to Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So, AKA, copy and paste what Christ did. That's what that means right there. Then verse 6 is kind of the key verse here to my point. Who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Now, I know that's one of those verses that is hard to understand when you first read it. But what it's saying is this: even though Jesus Christ was literally God, he chose not to play that card. Not because he wasn't God, not because it wasn't his legitimate card to play. It was, but he chose not to play it. If any person would have had every right in the world to not be abased, it would be him. If anyone should not have to suffer, it was God the Son. And yet Christ voluntarily waived all the rights and privileges that come along with being God. Then, as verses 7 and 8 of Philippians chapter 2 lay out, he did the exact opposite of citing his proper place at the top, and instead chose, in spite of his proper place at the top, to voluntarily come down all the way to the very bottom, dying the death of a criminal by dying the death of the cross. But then, Verses 9 through 11 make clear that is the very thing that earned him the greatest reward from the Father. What earned him his exalted status before the Father was not his intrinsic status, I am God, but rather his willingness to not take advantage of his intrinsic status is what earned him that glory, name above every name, from the Father. And so Paul says there in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, that we are to emulate Christ. How do we do that? By lowering ourselves voluntarily. By lowering ourselves voluntarily. See, a Christian must not only be known simply by the absence of sin, but a Christian must also be known by the presence of righteousness. See, because waiving your rights is more than just choosing to not do that which you didn't have a right to do anyway. That would be sin. Sinning is that which you don't have a right to do anyway. So that's not waiving your rights. That's just not doing that which you didn't have a right to do anyway, because no one has a right to sin. But for your light to shine, you got to do more than just not sin. Demonstrate the generosity of Christ is what you have to do for those fingerprints to clearly be made visible. You know, a whole lot of the Sermon on the Mount is about you surrendering your rights for the greater good of magnifying Christ's love. I mean, for example, Matthew 5:39, Jesus said, "But I say unto you, resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the left one also." See, so if someone walks up, slugs you in the face, okay, you obviously have every right on earth to defend yourself. But let's just suppose you gave that person one more chance to talk it out before physically retaliating. And let's just say that you did so not because you weren't sure you could win. Suppose that the person does certainly appear to be weaker than you. You have no doubt you could take that person, and yet you don't. See, it's not a matter of sinning versus not sinning, because the other guy is the one who's sinning. This is a matter of whether or not you waive your right to retaliate for the greater good of magnifying Christ. I mean, the following verse says this, "And if any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also." Would it be a sin for me to just say, "No, thank you, not today"? Of course not. But you see, gold medal Christianity is not the absence of sinning, but the presence of goodness. Every time you give away anything, you're waiving your right not to, right? Anytime you give away anything, you're waiving your right not to. That's how it works. Every time you help literally anybody, you're waiving your right to not help that person. Suppose you go to a restaurant, and let's just say that something about the service ain't good. And let's just say something about the food ain't good. You have every right in the world to complain. You have every right in the world to let your server know all the problems and all the bad things about your experience. But it might be a little awkward when you then invite your waitress to come to church. "My whole experience tonight was terrible. Hey, can I invite you to my church?" it might be a little awkward. You can complain, but it might be a little awkward to do that and then try to tell the server about Jesus. Now, I know. It all depends on exactly what we're talking about. I get it. Every situation is different, but you get my point. See? You get my point. You don't always have to exercise your rights. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Life might present you with a situation where you could sue somebody and might have every right in the world to do so. Okay, but maybe it's better if you don't. Maybe you could not. How about forgiving a debt? How about that? No human being is ever obligated to forgive a debt, but maybe at some point in your life you could choose maybe, to waive your right to not forgive a debt. Perhaps waiving your rights might come in the form of giving somebody another chance who really doesn't deserve another chance, you know? See, voluntarily surrendering liberty is the unique calling card of the genuine Christian and disciple of Jesus Christ. While the false apostles, false teachers, they did not possess any such quality whatsoever, and they attacked the one who did. When Paul asked sarcastically if he had committed an offense or if he had somehow incriminated himself by not taking money from the Corinthians, well, that certainly does imply that the false teachers must have made such an argument, which would make sense. The false teachers loved to charge people to listen to their heretical sermons. So therefore, perhaps they made the case against the Apostle Paul by saying, hey, if Paul's message is so great, why does he give it away for free? Only cheap things are given away for free. Perhaps they said, Paul has put a value on his own message, and apparently he has counted it as being worth nothing. So you see, you and I, we have to be prepared to be slandered. We have to be ready to have even our best actions twisted and used against us. But I tell you this, if you and I are truly consistent, then by God's grace, people are going to see through the lies about us. But people are only going to see those unique fingerprints if those unique fingerprints are there. Verse 8, Paul goes on, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. Here, obviously, when Paul uses the term robbery, he didn't literally rob another church, okay? He's using the term robbery metaphorically, just like how we do. When we look at the price of something and we go, whoo, man, this is highway robbery, right? That's not what we say. But it goes without saying, as long as it is a voluntary transaction between two parties, it's not literally robbery. Now, in this situation that he's talking about here, it was the churches of Macedonia that were willing to be, quote, robbed for the sake of the gospel. The sacrifice that they made was to help Paul in his ministry to the Corinthians. Look at verse 9. And when I was present with you, and I wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. So you know what? Earthly speaking, Macedonia got a bum deal, right? Earthly speaking, Macedonia got nothing out of this. Earthly speaking, it was highway robbery. But spiritually speaking, some things are worth getting robbed for. In every situation in which I have mentioned the idea of waiving one's rights, it will always feel like it's robbery because it sort of is. But there is a kind of robbery of which, if you are willing to suffer such robbery on earth, you'll be greatly rewarded in heaven. Kind of like the robbery mentioned in Philippians 2:6, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. For the one who was entitled above all others, entitled to do what? 100% entitled to stay right there at the very top. For him to come all the way down to the bottom was the worst case ever of highway robbery. But Christ was willing to be robbed for us. Christ was willing to do the unthinkable for us. Christ waived his rights for us so that we could imitate and magnify him by doing the same thing for others. But not the false teachers. No. They were too good to ever waive any entitlement. Seeing yourself as not too good to suffer robbery for the sake of the gospel, that is the unique fingerprint of a genuine Christian. So the first fingerprint is humility. The second is truth. Verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, no man shall stop me of this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Humility is very, very important, as has been emphasized this morning. But humility exists for a purpose, and the purpose is to uplift the truth. Being humble is an intrinsically good quality, but being humble is not the end in and of itself. It's to serve an end that is even greater than itself. Christians are not simply humble for no reason at all. Christians are not sacrificial simply for the sake of being sacrificial. Christians are not generous or accommodating so we can stand up and say, hey, check out how humble and accommodating we are. No, we're humble for one reason, because the truth of Christ has made us so. We are humble in order to magnify the truth of Christ. Paul uses the word boasting. Well, as humble vessels, the last thing we want to do is ever boast about ourselves, but we do boast. And not only is this boasting justified, but it's the very point of why we're humble in the first place. We are humble so that we get to boast about Christ. So the trade-off is this. Here's the trade-off. The less we make of ourselves, the more we get to make of Christ. The lower we are, the higher Christ gets to be. The less glory we take for ourselves, the more glory we get to bring to Him. That's a good trade. In this verse, Paul is not talking about boasting about his not taking money. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about boasting in the Lord. If anyone had earned his right to speak, it was Paul, for all the sacrifices that he had made. Just the same, you and I, we have to earn our right to speak. We need to give people a reason to listen to us. And we give people that reason. We earn that right to speak by showing them our consistency and our character. You and I are to earn our right to speak by having the unique fingerprints that only a genuine Christian has. And then we can, just like Paul here, say, ain't nobody ever going to shut me up. It's not about us being right. It's about our message being the truth. It's not about us being right. It's about our message being the truth. The true ambassadors of Christ have a foundation that the false representatives of Christ do not possess. And you know what that is? Thorough consistency with the Holy Scriptures. Christians are bold because we have a basis for being bold, which is that we have examined the Scriptures. We know what we are saying to be in line with them. So the enemies of Christ, they can attack us any way they want to, but the one thing that they must not be able to say about us is that anything we are saying or doing is not in line with the Scriptures, because it is. For this reason, we have to not only be humble, but also knowledgeable. Being able to explain exactly how it is that the gospel we preach truly is the one that comes from the Bible. The false teachers accused Paul of not actually being humble. The false teachers accused Paul of not actually representing the truth. And every bit as ridiculous as the first two accusations, the false teachers accused Paul of not actually loving the Corinthians. Apparently, they had insinuated that the only reason why Paul did not take their money was because he must not really want to be tied to them. That was, of course, preposterous, as Paul points out in verse 11. First word, wherefore. Wherefore means why. So Paul is asking here, why? Why have I done all this? Why have I done all this? And then he says in verse 11, wherefore? Because I love you not? You think that's why I did all this? Because I don't love you? God knoweth. There is an old expression for whenever it is that you know something, in spite of the person not coming out and directly telling you what it is that you know. And that expression goes like this. Well, how do you know? It's written all over your face. Right? Isn't that what we say? How did you know that? It's written all over your face. For the Apostle Paul, any accusation that he was not genuinely motivated by love was something that simply did not hold any water, because it was written all over his face. In verse 11, Paul appeals to the highest authority there is. He basically says this: if someone thinks that it is actually the case, if there are some among you that are so deceived and so blind and so ignorant as to not be able to see how much I love you, then all I can say at that point is God knows the truth. And you know what? God does. It's hard when someone you love doesn't love you back. But always know that God Almighty sees our Christ-like love, and it will never, ever, ever have been in vain. No matter how hard the enemy might try to throw a cloak over your humility, no matter how hard the enemy might try to throw a cloak over your consistency with the Word of God, the truth, and no matter how hard the enemy might try to throw a cloak over your love, those unique fingerprints of a genuine servant of God are so bright they cannot be hidden. The question for you today is this: are you giving the world the fruit that only you can give it? Jesus Christ said that we are the salt of the earth, and that it will not be salted from any other source. That means only through us can the world see the humility of Christ, the truth of Christ, or the love of Christ. They're not going to get it unless they see His fingerprints on us. I invite you to come forward at this invitation this morning. I invite you to come forward at this time and say, God, I want for the unique fingerprints of Jesus Christ such things as humility, truth, and love to be clearly seen in me. As we stand to our feet for this invitation, I invite you to come forward and kneel.